Hey guys, I want to answer a question that has been thrown out there, and my answer might be a little bit biased, but I'll explain why. And that question is, do I feel that Jiu Jitsu is the single most effective martial art for fighting? And is it effective in street fights? And so I'm going to go into that answer, and in that answer, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the UFC and the birth, really, of MMA. Back in 1993, when the UFC first started, that was actually the question that they were trying to answer: is what is the most effective martial art? What is the most? It's a centuries old question. And back when the UFC first started, what happened was, which was really significant, is the UFC started out as a tournament style format. And so what happened was they had specialists in each specific martial art, all different martial arts, and they were supposed to compete against each other in basically a no rules fight. And so what I mean by no rules fight is there were some very minor rules, and the minor rules were no biting and no eye gouging, but groin strikes were allowed. And back then, there was no such thing as a weight divisions. There was actually no weight divisions at all, and no time limit. So basically, what they would do is they would throw two guys in a cage, and whoever would either get knocked out or submitted, the other guy, one guy would, he would lose from either getting knocked out or submitted, and then the next guy would go on to continue to fight. And what was really significant about that format is because there was no weight divisions, no time limits, and it was a tournament style format, whoever was going to win that event, you would have to win 3 fights in one night to be able to win. Now that is just crazy, to fight 3 fights in one night to win with no time limit and no weight division. And so the Hoist Gracie was the winner of the first UFC, and that event really opened the world's eyes to Gracie Jiu Jitsu, or Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. At that time, almost nobody had really heard of Gracie Jiu Jitsu or Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. Back then, in those days, it was more stand-up martial arts that were really popular and common. A lot of kicking, a lot of punching. And so nobody had really been exposed to a martial art that was grappling based. So Hoist Gracie won the first UFC event, and he was actually one of the least experienced of all of the brothers in his family. He was one of the least experienced fighters of his brothers. And so that was a really significant event. He won the first UFC in under 5 minutes. 3 fights in under 5 minutes, which is crazy. So not only did he win that event, he went on to win the second UFC, which had even more fights. There was 4 fights in one night that you had to win to be able to win that tournament. So it started out with 32, I believe, 32 competitors. He ended up winning that one also. And the crazy thing, like I said, about a tournament style format, and actually this is one of the reasons that they actually implemented gloves into the UFC, is because every time you win a fight, you have to come out unscathed. And what I mean by that is you have to come out without taking enough damage so that you can continue on and win the next fight. And so one of the things that was happening a lot to a lot of strikers, guys that were using primarily striking, is they would end up breaking their hands and would not be able to continue. They weren't able to continue into the next round, so that it was really difficult for them to win the tournament. So even if they won their fight, they would break their hand and not able to continue. And I think that's what happened to Ken Shamrock in the third UFC. He was supposed to be in the finals, but he couldn't continue, and so they had put an alternate in. So the third UFC, Hoist had also won his fight, the first fight, with a guy named Kimo Leopoldo, but he was too exhausted to continue on to fight again. And so he actually withdrew from the third tournament without losing. He won his fight. He finished Kimo in an armbar, and I believe Kimo had outweighed him by almost 60 or 70 pounds. So it was a really tough fight for him. He wasted a lot of energy during the fight, and he was not able to continue. But he competed in the 4th UFC, again against specialists from all different martial arts styles. And he again won that tournament. Now, the last fight in the 4th UFC was against a guy named Dan Severn, who was 260 pounds. And at the time, Hoist was about 175. So Dan Severn, who was about as accomplished a wrestler you can get. He was an alternate on the U.S. Olympic team, freestyle wrestling for the U.S. Olympic team in 1984. And I think he barely missed in 1988. The U.S. Olympic team, he barely missed making the team in 88. So pretty much as accomplished as you can get as a wrestler. And also, so he was very, very comfortable grappling. And he also outweighed Hoist by almost 85 pounds. Now, the nice thing about that event is Hoist had an indefinite amount of time to be able to win the match. The match lasted over 15 minutes, and Hoist was finally able to win the fight with a triangle choke, a choke off his back. And so, when people ask me the question, do I think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is effective in a street fight? I feel that it is the most effective art if you are only going to train one martial art, and if you only have time to really focus on one art. I really feel that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the most effective, and I feel with those events it had kind of proven itself. And really those events is what really became the birth of mixed martial arts. Back then, again, I said MMA did not even exist back then. There was no such thing as MMA. What happened was, as Hoist started winning these tournaments and started just dominating these opponents without basically winning these fights, without taking a scratch, without getting hurt at all, what happened was all of these other martial artists started to realize that they had to start to learn jiu-jitsu. They had to start to really understand jiu-jitsu, train jiu-jitsu, be able to be comfortable in jiu-jitsu, be comfortable grappling and be comfortable with submissions, to even be able to compete in these, back then what it was called no holds barred events. Okay, no holds barred meaning basically no time limit, no weight division, pretty much the only rules, no biting and no eye gouging. But even then, groin strikes were allowed. So all of these martial artists actually had to pick up and had to start training jiu-jitsu to even be able to compete in these events. And so that was really the birth of MMA, was the domination by Hoist Gracie in these no-hold-barred events forced these other martial artists to start cross-training in jiu-jitsu so that they could even survive and stand a chance of competing. And so really jiu-jitsu is such a dominant and powerful martial art for fighting. And one of the reasons, the main reason that it is such an effective art is because, especially when there's no time limit and no weight division involved, what happens is if we're forced to fight a bigger and stronger opponent, the last thing that we want to do is we want to stand up and exchange punches and strikes with them. A bigger opponent is almost always going to have a reach advantage, and they're almost always going to have an advantage in power. Okay, and so the last thing we want to do is really start exchanging strikes with a bigger and stronger opponent. And what jiu-jitsu does is it really, one of the common terms in jiu-jitsu is position before submission. And so one of the things with jiu-jitsu is we're really focused on putting ourselves into dominant positions. And what I mean by that is the whole focus of jiu-jitsu is constantly to stack the odds in our favor when in our fight. We're constantly trying to put ourselves into a position where there is minimal risk of taking damage, but we have all the advantage in being able to do damage to our opponent or catch them in a submission. And so with a lot of these positions in jiu-jitsu, when we position ourselves into these dominant positions, the fight all of a sudden becomes a completely unfair fight. Okay, So for example, the mount position or the cross-side position, for the person on top in the mount or in a cross-side position, the person on top has all of the advantages with their ability to do damage, and all of the advantage with their ability to go for submissions. And so the person on the bottom stands really, as long as that they can maintain that position, as long as the person on top is able to stay on top, he has a very, very little risk of getting hurt. And so that's something that we're always trying to do in jiu-jitsu, and something that I'm always telling my students and talking to my students about is we're always looking to put ourselves into a position where we can't be hurt, but we can hurt the other person. We're always basically trying to stack all of the odds in our favor, and that is really, really important in a street fight, because in a street fight you don't know what's going to happen, and a lot of times these situations can become life or death. People die all the time in fights just from getting hit in the head, or their head hitting the concrete, or things happen in fights where people do die in fights. And so when we're exposed and there's that much risk, what we're always looking to do is we're always looking to stack the odds in our favor. And so that's one of the huge things about jiu-jitsu, is really understanding these positions, understanding how we can get out of bad positions, understanding how we can get to these dominant positions, and so maintaining these dominant positions, so that as long as we're fighting, there's very, very minimal risk for us to get hurt, very minimal risk that we're going to get submitted. And of course in jiu-jitsu we have the ability to go for submission holds, which really save us from taking damage. And so, like I said, in the UFCs, one of the things that would really was detrimental to a lot of the strikers and stand-up fighters, because they weren't wearing gloves, they wanted to have their hands to be able to grab, they were breaking their hands. They were breaking their hands so often that the MMA glove was created, a glove that basically provided enough protection so that it would protect people's hands from getting broken, but it still allowed them to grip, and they were very, very minimal so that they still could do a damage. There was not a lot of cushioning on the glove, but it was enough that they would prevent the stand-up fighters from breaking their hand. And so that's really, really important too, is anytime we get in a fight, we want to reduce the risk of damaging ourselves as much as possible. And so that's what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu also does, is it really puts us in an environment and gives us the capability to win fights without taking any damage, without hurting ourselves in the fight by punching someone in the head and breaking our hand, and also by putting ourselves in these positions where really there's very minimal risk of us being hurt. And so I hope that helps answer that question. And if you want to go back and check out those early UFCs, I know, I think they're all on the UFC.com on their Fight Pass. I think you can go back and watch those. And those were a really, really interesting time. It was before anyone had really known or understood anything about grappling. And those first few UFCs is really what exposed the world's eyes to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the effectiveness of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And it's what helped to make Jiu-Jitsu the fastest and largest growing martial art in the world today. So anyways, guys, hope that helps, and thank you.